Let's talk about it.
Hello and welcome back to Thicc Radio, the podcast where we talk about gaming and everything in its orbit. I'm James.
And I'm Tim, so let's get into it. Today we're welcoming to the show for the first time. Today we've got Ash.
Hey, Ash.
Hi, James. Hi, Tim. How are you both today?
Doing good. I've had a very lazy Sunday, so I'm in a, very relaxed mood.
I'm doing good as well. I am recovering from travel, but otherwise doing okay. How are you?
I'm all right. I had a pretty bad sleep last night. There was a huge storm, and my house has like all these trees overhanging it, so it was a bit worried something would fall on me. But I'm here.
Valid concern.
Valid concern. And in lieu of the accent, I will say, oh no. Oh no, that sounds absolutely dreadful.
I'm not going to have to get subtitles to understand you guys once you start going, are you?
No.
It's a possibility.
It'll be fine, Tim. I've been educating you for decades now on the ins and outs, the intricacies of Australian bogan culture. You should know your bits by now. No, it's fine. Listeners, if you haven't been able to tell, our fabulous guest Ash is actually also Australian, and more so than simply myself, is in fact First Nations Australian, and is joining us today for a fantastic episode to explore the Indigenous side a little bit, culture of his mob. So there's actually a little something that we do in Australia in terms of especially Indigenous events and things like that, which I think, is it when an elder does it, it's a welcome to country, and when other people do it, it's an acknowledgement of country. Is that the distinction there?
Yeah, so welcome to country is normally done by a traditional owner of that country, and normally by the elders of that country, and only for the area that is their country as well. And an acknowledgement of country is when, I guess, anyone, so like settlers or non-Indigenous people or Indigenous people who aren't from that country, acknowledge the country that they're on. And I guess you're back in the UK now, and so I've come into work early this morning, so I'm based down in Bunurong in Wurundjeri country, and I'd really like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and the fact that the lands have never been ceded. And I'd like to extend the acknowledgement to, I guess, both the countries that you're on as well, which is, I guess, more common now that things are more global and people are zooming around everywhere as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I suppose if you had to extend that out to everyone, depending on how many people are on a Zoom call, and then people are based all around the world, it's like that could really take up some time in the morning.
Well, I guess not everyone normally does it, but I think it's more just acknowledging that, especially in international context, that there are a lot of Indigenous lands across the world, and so it's always maybe a polite way to kind of deal with colonization that happened everywhere.
I think this is a really interesting opportunity to explore indigeneity from a non-American perspective, because you and I have had these chats, Ash. I think even as an Australian, most of the kind of memes and conversation I know of that happens around indigeneity is very American-centric, which, very valid for them to say what they say and rep themselves, and of course all this, but, it's not like the Indigenous experience or the Indigenous mentality or values or culture is monolithic around the world. And in fact, that's kind of like the whole point of being against colonization. It's actually kind of digging to the root and being like, no, there is good shit here from way back when, and we should really make that effort to kind of dig through it and learn more about it. So, just kind of putting that out there. Really thankful that you've agreed to be here and share a bit of your culture with us. So thank you for that.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So listen, let's get into the good juice. So you would describe yourself as Gonpool from Quandamooka, and your family is from Minjerribah. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So Quandamooka country is the islands of the southeast coast of Queensland. So sort of, I guess, off the coast of Brisbane and the Gold Coast, kind of in between them both. It's a bit of like a kind of shore-based archipelago of like a number of islands. And Minjerribah is one of the largest. The majority of the clans from our country live on Minjerribah now, but in the past, which is Gurnpool, New Knuckle, and Nuji. And in the past, Nuji were from Modern Island or Mungulpin, which is the island above Minjerribah. And then Minjerribah is, I guess, kind of just the main one now. There's a number of townships on the island. It's kind of a small community. It's like one of the more highly denser population of Aboriginal people in Southeast Queensland. The others being some of like the kind of urban sort of environments just south of Brisbane as well. Yeah. It's a very beautiful country. I would say probably the most beautiful country in Australia.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a bit of competition between the different mobs and who's got the most beautiful country, but can't pass islands and salt water and sandy beaches.
Yeah. I mean, I know we've talked about this before, so listeners, I'm not sure if you can Google Minjerribah and know exactly where that is. I believe it's Stradbroke, North and South Stradbroke Island is what would come up on a Google map search. Does it include the Whitsundays? Or is that different territory?
No, it's different territory.
Bitches.
Yeah. Okay. We don't speak of that.
Okay. Well, don't Google Whitsundays.
Also beautiful, but...
Well, they're very beautiful. But Stradbroke is also really nice, people. Stradbroke is really nice. Google Stradbroke Island, okay? It's very lovely. Quandamooka country, okay? Beautiful bit of land. Gorgeous little setting, right? Good stuff. I'm curious to know a little bit, what is the significance of country to different Indigenous folk? Because, of course, I think we can determine in this sort of like modern day, we've got borders, we've got resources, we've got all these ideas of like why it's important to be like, this is my land and this is what matters to me. But I think a narrative we often see with Indigenous folk is that there's really more to the story, and sometimes there's maybe even a spiritual or holistic element to the importance of country and of land. So putting that out there for you, what is the significance of all of those elements for you?
Yeah, definitely. I think the concept of country, and I guess like the extensions of that kind of caring for country sort of come from, I guess, like the old times of kind of pre-colonization and sort of understanding, I guess, like all the dreamings and sort of the actual spirits and kind of the way that country actually cares for the communities that are on it as well. And so that sort of, I think, sort of feeds into, I guess, sort of ideas of environmentalism, and trying to look after the environment that is country, but also the way that when we do that, how then that actually produces a healthy environment in which it can nurture us as well. So I guess being an island country, a lot of our communities rely on sort of fishing and like the local water and aquaculture. So a lot of, I guess, our kind of care for country sort of centers around looking after the marine environment, as well as the sand islands as well, and working out different ways to kind of care for that. So, you know, for a long time, our country was mined as like one of the largest sand mines in Australia, and sort of pushing back against that as a way of sort of trying to look after, because, you know, our island also provides, I think, a significant amount of fresh water to Brisbane and other spaces as well. So I think that's, I guess, part of it. And I think that idea as well is something which sort of generally kind of goes across a lot of Australia. I don't think I've ever met an Indigenous person who doesn't have that similar kind of understanding of how country cares for the communities that they're on. And so I think it's interesting how that seems to be something that's quite common across all of the communities, despite the cultural differences or the different specificities of where they live and which mobs they're from. And also, you know, something which I think you see internationally as well, like a lot of other communities who are also Indigenous having maybe a closer connection to like the specific lands and the spirits of those places and how that sort of interacts.
I think that makes perfect sense, you know, even from the perspective of, you know, of course, neither Tim nor I would be Indigenous to where we currently live, but, you know, I think we can all relate to that idea of, you know, there are places in the world that we find significant to ourselves, places that we find special, especially for people who go traveling. You come across a specific location, you go to a park, and maybe you think there's this really great tree, that you sit under. For some reason, you've just gone, I'm going to sit under this tree, and you just feel this moment of serenity, and you go, oh, look at me, I've traveled, I've gone all across the world, and I found this park and this tree, and I've sat under this tree, feeling this moment of peace. And even though maybe you've just come here and this tree doesn't have a name and you don't know all the bits around you, you still feel a sense of warmth for that particular moment in that particular place. And so if you had that opportunity to travel back, you'd find that exact spot and you'd revisit that place of serenity and feel that connection again. And, you know, I think we can all relate to a sense of there are spaces in the world that feel important to us. And I think it's quite beautiful that from a cultural perspective, you'll have that. You'll have that across the board, and you'll have this almost like fucking Captain Planet perspective of like your bit of country, where it's like we've got to really come together and kind of make that shit good. Like no one else is going to do it. We got to be the ones to do the thing.
I think for some of it comes from like a really deep and like, you know, passed down sort of knowledge of how certain things operate for our countries as well. Like, so how the seasons may be specific to each part of Australia and each kind of country as well. Or what needs to be done to care for like the flora and fauna of that place as well. So if you think of like sort of cultural burning practices, which is sort of burning back at certain times of the year when it's wetter. So it's like kind of like a cool burn. So then the seed, like there's certain seeds in Australia that only like regerminate after like fire. And so these sort of practices that I think are really specific to different kind of locations across Australia that the different mobs have actually passed down through generation to generation and still kind of practice those, even though there's maybe been disruptions at different points from colonization, actually now sort of a reinvigorating some of that knowledge and kind of reintroducing and seeing what that actually does for their country in terms of making, certain places healthy again.
I just want to chime in because you mentioned seasons. The Noongar identify that there are 6 seasons on their calendar, which honestly, if you live in Australia and especially in like the southwest rural Australia, like you can definitely identify like those 6 seasons make a lot more sense than the traditional 4 because like Tim, having been to America now and like a little bit of stuff, I can definitely get that sense of like, okay, like autumn is a real season there. It really happens with the leaves and the pumpkin spice, and it's a bit cooler and things are quite distinguished. Whereas like does not quite align with the biomes of Australia.
Well, you know what though, that can vary depending on where you live in the United States. It's a common saying here in Cleveland that we have 3 seasons. We have winter, and construction. Because our city is constantly under construction and winter lasts for like 7 months here. So I mean, it's obviously it's interesting how much it's changed in just the 15 years I've lived in this state, because the winters are getting shorter and they are getting much more mild. We're seeing a lot less snowfall. We're seeing a lot less of those like polar vortex temperatures. So
if I can maybe probe, what is the kind of day-to-day life like when you're living on country?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a different pace.
Well,
It's like island life.
Maybe let's hear the contrast. Like, what is day-to-day life like in this, in the typical Australian city versus day-to-day living on country?
Yeah. So I live down in Melbourne, so down in Victoria. And I like work a number of jobs, and they're all like sort of in arts and teaching. And so it can be pretty flat out, like very, very long days, working projects. So I guess it's like quite a fast pace, very busy. Like now we're sort of, I guess, like coming out of like, I guess, COVID interventions. Like there's a lot of people sort of returning to streets and to public transport, returning to the office as well. So I find like it can just be like, pretty overwhelming. The amount of people that I sort of encounter in the city each day. So in contrast, I think going back like on country to Minjerribah, it's sort of such a different pace. It's like a lot slower. It's a smaller community. Island life, it takes 40 minutes via boat to get there after, a long plane flight. Just kind of, I guess, like a lot of sort of hanging out with family, a lot of bushwalks, like, you know, kind of going out on country. A lot of my family is still fishermen, so I often visit during winter, just to be sort of around while the fishing's happening. And kind of, yeah, going out to the beach and sort of helping spot for fish or help organize like equipment or, you know, just be there when like the action's happening. So it's like a very different sort of experience. I think it's in contrast, like despite I guess Sydney and Melbourne having quite large Aboriginal populations, it's kind of nice to actually go to a community that, you know, you're visible as well. You know, I'm very familiar with like everyone who's like from our community, so sort of walking around and kind of seeing like a lot of uncle and aunties like in the local cafes and stuff like that, and actually, you know, seeing the Aboriginal presence in the community, where I think sometimes the scale of Melbourne and Sydney, it can be hard to, you know, recognize mob on the street, unless you go to like kind of specific suburbs or communities that they're present.
I don't know. I find that really interesting because I think that's really one of like the big colonial things that I think a lot of us as white people, as Western people, wrestle with. It's like trying to picture a world in which you're not having to adhere to like 9 to 5 rigid Western ideals of like how your day, how your life has to work and flow and function. That in fact there are peoples around the world who do things
Mm,
radically differently, and they're doing just fine. They don't have to have mental health days off of work because their workload is fucking insane and are being driven into the ground. They're just having a good old fucking time.
mm.
Noshing
It's
on
like,
a kangaroo, you know what I mean?
yeah, you know, if we think about in comparison, the colonization of Australia, I think happened about 250 years after North America. So technology had changed quite significantly. The political world sort of views had changed. Um, and I think that sort of definitely, and you know, the type of people who were convicts sort of, as like those early sort of colonists versus then the free settlers that kind of came after that, sort of very much shaped the type of colonization that we experienced. You know, and a lot of that is like a record of these kind of critical, like that we didn't have this Protestant work like ethic or stuff like that. And but you know, like I think if you go back to some of those historical records, there's also quite telling sort of things about more disappointment that we wouldn't be good slaves. When we were growing up, there was very much the history wars were raging in the 90s, which were about, I guess, like a conservative sort of view of what Australian history should be, which was very much in favor of, you know, maybe not even telling a true history, but actually a favorable history of Australia versus the historians that were really trying to actually delve deep into the record and actually uncover what was the truth around Australia.
Oh yeah, revisionist history. We have to put up with that in the US all the time. Like most of our history is revisionist.
And please correct me if I'm wrong. I think the Aboriginal Australian flag was only created in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, exactly. I think in the 80s, I wouldn't know the exact date. You know, and that's even like it's kind of had its own issues recently around the copyright of that flag and how it can be used by a community and um, yeah, and some of those have been resolved, but it has been resolved through the Australian government purchasing the copyright of that, which, you know, for some members of the community, that's really distressing. I was going to say, like, but I think the lack of knowing is kind of very telling for that conversation as well. Is like, you know, what Australians actually know around their own history and why that's kind of maybe gone so awry in terms of Australian education.
I know we've kind of touched on this ever so slight, but I would be curious to ask, what do you feel is the biggest misconception people have about Indigenous Australians?
Oh.
And feel free to take that question however you like.
I think there's so many. You know, and I think it becomes from maybe that, I guess, like invisibility that I think you sort of just touched on around the idea that Aboriginal people are elsewhere and not in urban environments, and you know, like or like the prevailing idea of what Aboriginal people look like as well. Um, you know, like kind of dark skin, flat sort of nose, like these sort of, I think, caricatures that have sort of, I guess, been pushed through like this like Australiana like of imagery as well. And it's not to say that like there aren't mob who have those appearances, but I think that's very much kind of this idea of kind of legitimizing this idea that there's like an authentic Aboriginal person and then the inauthentic. And I think that's something which is like this kind of relentless sort of attack that the fair skin or sort of white passing Aboriginal person is illegitimate. And that they're sort of rotting system or something like that. So I think like that's sort of one kind of misconception that sort of quite prevails. I think the other one, which is really hard, is just the idea that we're just a singular mob. I sort of think about this like a lot, that I think there's definitely a moment where we're kind of almost three things at once. Like we're Indigenous, as in an experience of kind of colonization that sort of connects us with Indigenous people from across the world. Aboriginal, which kind of connects us specifically with all the Aboriginal people from across Australia, but actually then our specific communities, cultures, and histories as well, because I guess colonization, was a wave across Australia. And like in the same way that I might kind of look at the US and kind of go, what our experience of colonization was different to that because of the time difference. That also happened here as well. Like the East Coast got hit hard in a way that happened, 80 years later for the West and the North. So I think it's like those sort of differences as well as the like culturally specific differences as well, like in terms of speaking different languages. I think it's like over 250 different languages from across Australia and the different spirits and stories and specific knowledges to those places as well. So I think it's like, often we can be kind of just homogenized to a singular group and people just don't know that there's like a specificity.
Something you said at first, it really stuck out to me. It's that idea of the illegitimate Aboriginal because you don't have certain features. Tim, you shared with us before about your experience as someone who is mixed race and
Yes.
how, because of the color of your skin or the shape of the nose or because of different aspects of your genetic structure, people will point to you and think, you're this or you're that. And you're left to contend with somehow being responsible for everyone else's perspective of you, plus who you actually are, but also going on a journey to actually get to where you actually are, because everyone's out here pointing so many fingers and that cacophony of just crap that we do, that it really kind of puts you in a place. I'm curious to ask for you specifically, Tim, do you feel like that resonates with you, that element of people placing a sense of illegitimacy?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And let me tell you, it's so much fun to have other people tell you who and what you are all the time, like, and just outright assumptions, like someone coming up to me and saying like, well, you speak Spanish, don't you? And I'm like, why would you assume that right off the bat? And they're like, well, you're Latino, aren't you? I'm like, I'm not. If I was, that'd be great, but I'm not. So I mean, you're looking at me and you're thinking something immediately. You don't bother to ask me. And then when I tell you what my exact genetic makeup is, because now I actually know, now that I've done a DNA test, then you want to sit there and argue with me that it must be wrong or that I shouldn't trust the results. It's like, so there's no way to win. I've spoken many times about what it's like to be, constantly like not being a part of any community legitimately. It's like you're too much of one thing, you're not enough of another, and it fucking sucks. So yeah, I totally identify with that.
And something where I think like the Aboriginal community in Australia, I think, have also pushed back on more recently. I think as I've sort of grown up on, or like I don't know, like more broadly as well. Like I think I'm seeing like a lot of younger people who really solid in their identity, and like when someone you'll have like some old white woman be like, "And what percentage are you?" Like you're like,
I've had to
like
experience that too. They're like, well, how much? Because like, so I am,
yeah.
my genetic makeup is Caucasian, Black, South Asian, and like a very small percentage, like 1% East Asian, right? So if I just like if people ask me that question, where are you from, which is one of the worst questions that people can possibly ask you. But so whenever I get that question, I say, well, I'm mixed, but then they want to know the exact mix. And I'm like, why is this so important? Why do you care about percentages? And like over here in the US, I know that that's a really, old ass idea that goes all the way back to, I think it's post Civil War, where the percentage meant like your voting rights and if you could own property. But the fact that it's carried over more than 200 years into the present day, it's like, let it go. Percentages don't fucking matter.
Well, and I think that's the thing. And it's like, this is what I mean in terms of like looking historically at what happened in the US, because that was imported into Australia. That idea of like blood quantum and like sort of percentage rights and what that actually meant for our communities. And it varied. I think there was like, should have known this because I used in a class the other day, but there were like 66 different definitions based on these like different percentages and ways to identify whether someone was Aboriginal or not in Australia. And some of them were really flippant. It was like you were like, I think it was in WA, there was like a really weird one where you could be made not Aboriginal, so and a full citizen, but only if the government decided, but then you could become Aboriginal the moment the government decided that they wanted to try you as an Aboriginal or police you as an Aboriginal. And so it was this idea that you could actually receive a proper citizenship, but only, if the government decided that they wanted to. But it's prevalent. Like I remember throughout the 90s, like telling people whatever my blood quantum would have been based on doing rough estimates of, okay, well, if my grandfather was full and then blah, 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 blah. And it's just like, and I think I didn't know then how problematic that was. And I think it wasn't until like I started learning more about those sort of histories and kind of going, actually, why am I feeling that I need to be accountable to these people who really don't know me and really just, are trying to, for themselves, work out where I stand and whether I actually have a legitimacy in this conversation, and, and actually drawing that to their attention, kind of going, actually, at what point do I, like, was it, when my grandfather taught the culture and sort of Aboriginal experience to my father, like, is that, like, at what point do I become not Aboriginal through like a lineage of what's actually passed down through our family as well? And so it's this kind of really bizarre sort of space. And I think it's hard as well, because I think in terms of like DNA testing, like even that's something which a lot of mobs in Australia are sort of resistant to, because we have an extreme right here who are advocating that data would then be used to determine who would be Aboriginal under Australian law or not. And so I think there's a number of people who are sort of resisting having DNA tests because, that data can be sold. And, if that right wing take control, what does that then mean for, our future experiences when it comes down to particular genes?
It's interesting, and maybe this seems like a bit of a left of field comparison, but it makes me think of the parable of the ship of Theseus, which is the famous warship of Greek mythology, which of course goes through battles and gets a little bit banged up, and so you add a couple of planks of wood here, a thread of rope there, maybe you change the sail, but over time they eventually realize that the ship of Theseus is made up of all now completely replacement parts. None of the original parts of the boat are now on the boat. The boat is made up of 100% replacement parts. So is this the ship of Theseus, or is it something completely new? And I think it's an interesting thought experiment, because it's like we associate identity onto an inanimate object. And so it's like the actual material that goes into it is completely irrelevant, because it's all about that culture and that narrative and that story that we attribute and attest to something. So much like what you're saying, the concept of blood quantity is completely irrelevant. How much defines you is not the point. It is the culture and it is the lived experience, I think a great example that some people may be aware of is Trixie Mattel, who is Ojibwe, I think is the tribe, I believe. But, they've gone on record before saying even though they are genetically, Native American, they don't identify with that part of themselves because they weren't raised as part of that culture. And they've expressed, I'm not going to quote a certain interview here, people. I know it's happened before. Go Google, do the thing. You know, they've expressed a sense of they don't feel it's right for them to claim it because their lived experience is that of a white person. And so it also works both ways. You know, it's not an obligation for anyone who is quote unquote genetically any one thing to have to do that for anyone's benefit except their own and what feels right for them to do. So to anyone out there who's like, I don't know, trying to keep score with people about if they're black enough, indigenous enough, whatever enough, please fuck off.
Stop.
Just stop.
Please stop.
Stop and it's done. I want to pivot ever so slightly because this is a podcast for gaining. What is like the indigenous vibe around like becoming fat, being fat, stereotypes around fatness? What is the sort of narrative, at least within your mob, around fatness?
I guess for our mob, it's like it is complicated because I think there's a number of gaps between Indigenous experiences and Australian sort of experiences. And so I think I don't want to, I guess, I want to maybe sort of briefly speak to the fact that like there is like an age like I guess like in Aboriginal people are dying younger in Australia, and you know some of this is coming out of health inequalities, access to kind of healthy foods, and all these sort of aspects. There's also much higher rates of diabetes in Aboriginal kind of communities, as well as, and that sort of comes from, I guess, kind of genetic determinants as well, but also like, yeah, these other sort of issues in terms of access to healthy sort of food. But I kind of think, while acknowledging those sort of things, I actually think largely our communities are a lot more accepting of like larger people and maybe more kind of fan inclusive because of these sort of factors, but also the way our mob is sort of kind of built as well. And so I sort of think, like, I'm not sure if it was part of this question or maybe a different question as well, like in terms of how people are kind of included. Like it's quite, you know, there's a number of like Indigenous clothing brands in Australia now. A lot of healthcare centres or kind of other community organisations will kind of print T-shirts and like other sort of apparel with like kind of beautiful like sort of designs as well. And you know, like a lot of those will be printed, like you know, made in kind of plus size things. Like so, like I'm not sure up to what XL, but like you know, to account for the size and shape of our community. And there's always like a lot of shade that gets thrown away when like someone who does something that's for mob don't do that. So like, you know, if another company, let's say, commissions like Indigenous artists to produce a jumper, and then it doesn't go into like those plus sizes, there'll be like a lot of like, who the fuck do they think they are? Like, you know, who's this actually for? Yeah. And so, you know, I think that's important. Like, I think it's kind of actually going, if you want to engage with our kind of culture, then sort of acknowledge, yeah, our sizes and our shape. And yeah.
I love that because I think it's something we come across a lot on the pod is when it comes to fatness, especially in different areas like fashion is a big one. People want your dollar, but they don't want to see you with that dollar. You know, it's like people are very quick. Oh gosh, what was I listening to just the other day? I think it was an episode of Who Hurt You with Sophie Hagen, a fabulous plus size comedian, actress from Denmark. It's one of their older episodes, but you know, she was interviewing, I believe it was Scotty. I could be wrong about this. Please don't quote me. But essentially, they were saying that they went to a conference with in regards to promotions and bits and pieces like that, and they knew people who had been paid money who were plus size to promote the plus size options for a brand, but that brand was already in the process of pulling those plus sizes because they basically just wanted to get the money as quickly as possible without actually having to produce the product, which is fucking insane. Like, we often ask the question, fat people just want good shit. If you make good shit, we will buy it. we have money. If you were the first one, you would get all of the money, you know? Like,
Mm.
why would you not want to do this? And that speaks to systemic fat phobia, that people are just like, I'm prepared to make a loss on money because I don't want fats to be seen wearing my brand, because I believe that that will devalue my brand in a way that is greater than the loss of that money that I would make, which is
Mm.
insane. But there you go.
No,
I'm really glad that amongst Indigenous people, at least, there is a sense of, that shade, that sense of, you gonna make this for everybody, mate? Because Uncle,
well,
he's a bit bigger. Come on now, he wants to wear this.
well, I think it's like really like, because like all these brands will propose to be for community, so I'd be like, oh, we've picked this famous Australian, like, sorry, famous like Indigenous artist. We've commissioned this artwork to go onto a jumper or onto a t-shirt or blah blah blah, and propose that it's for all the community. But then if it only goes up to whatever, like 1XL or like XL, yeah, you're sort of like, well, who is this for? Like,
Mm.
like the fashionable inner city kids that you know and then I think that's the thing. It's like, well, maybe if it's proposing to be for community, then it should come in community sizes. And yeah, like,
Yeah,
there's a lot of guys with big guts walking around, so I just saying, you gotta get them in those t-shirts. Yeah.
absolutely. Please do. Or crop tops if you don't want to. If you want to leave those belly, please.
It's our preference,
That's
but
my preference. I think it's fat phobic to put big people in fully covered clothing. It's appropriate to put all big boys in crop tops. That's the new vibe. That's the
yeah,
one, you know.
bring it in,
Um,
James.
put a stamp on it, you know. I do want to ask as well, like, what is the gaming community like amongst Indigenous Australians in general? Like,
Mm.
in your experience, is there like a cohort of peeps out here like vibing together, or is it a little bit more people scattered?
I don't know a lot of other Indigenous Australians um who are gainers in our community. Like, I haven't sort of touched base, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. So I know like other um, Aboriginal men who are larger, that have been kind of other sort of sites or sort of spaces, who maybe don't identify as a gainer, but um, are larger men. I think, if anyone's out there, feel free to come at me. My whatever, partychubbybears on
Oh yeah,
Instagram.
yeah.
Yeah.
People, listen up to the socials at the end of this episode. Okay, here is an Indigenous Australian repping for the gains. If you are out there
Yeah,
looking for community and you don't know a bitch, we found you one. He's right here.
come
We'll
at
put the
me.
socials at the end of the episode.
Yeah. But I would say, I think, I don't know like what your experience was when you're in Australia recently, if you went on any of the dating apps. Like, Australia can still be pretty iffy. And so I kind of think
Yeah,
what people include or don't include in their sort of profiles can also be telling as well. And I think, like, if you're sort of navigating like your life as an Aboriginal person in Australia on the daily, sometimes like a break from being not like upfront, or like kind of just like leaving some of that until later, like in kind of conversation, can help in kind of dating profiles, because just like, I don't maybe want to be faced with like just the racist bullshit that happens. And so I just think, like, yeah, there's, I think, a number of factors, I guess. Mm.
yeah. It's I was talking to Tim about this just before. Like I say, I think it was wonderful to go back to Australia and see so many new intentional ways to include indigeneity just into everyday life. I thought that was absolutely wonderful. But, in many ways, Australia is good old. You know,
Mm.
WA doesn't stand for Western Australia. It stands for wait a while, because you'll be waiting a while for shit to happen and for shit to change. And wouldn't you know it, the apps and the men's is very much the same. A lot of viewpoints on Indigenous people, a lot of commentary, a lot of language, remains the same. And it's quite interesting that people like to dig their heels in about it, which I've never understood, you know.
Mm.
I mean, I've used the example before. There is a brand of cheese in Australia that is no longer named this, but I can't even say it without feeling icky because obviously the only reason anyone ever fucking talked about that brand of cheese was to use it as impetus excuse to use a certain word because of the cheese. And they've since renamed the cheese to cheer cheese. And, I think people have decided back and forth whether or not they think it was appropriate or not. I think it's a good move. Just, we know what we use the word for in our cultural context. Let's remove it. Let's not give ourselves ammunition and whatnot. But I don't know. It's just interesting that people hold on to that with such passion and vigor, and they don't seem to think that there's anything wrong with that. That's interesting to me. So I want to ask a question in two ways. One, is there like a traditional mob dish that your family makes, or like a food related cultural practice that when you get to engage with it, eat it, it reminds you of home? And if not, is there like an Aussie snack? And if there's an Aussie snack, tell me why it's chicken crimpies.
Oh, whoa. Well, in terms of kind of traditional kind of mob meals, my family are fishermen. We're sort of like the last fishing family on the island as well. And so I guess mullet would be kind of our main sort of traditional dish. Every time I'm up, especially during winter, there's always like a big kind of mullet sort of fish, or if I'm up for like festivals or ceremony or like sorry business like a funeral, like our family will always provide fish for the whole community. So it's like filleting them to like grilled fish sort of sandwiches, or just like grilled fish kind of or fried fish sort of like just by itself, like a little bit of lemon. It's good. It's like always super fresh. So yeah, and always tons of it, like just like eskies of it to grill up enough for everyone. So I don't think anyone ever goes hungry in those events. And then in terms of just Australian snack, I'm such a fan of Tim Tams. I trust when you went back to the UK, you just like left clothes in Australia and only brought Tim Tams back.
And just made space. I didn't want to mention this before, but I have a little treat at home that I was noshing on earlier, and they're like crack cocaine, honestly, chicken crimpies. I don't know what the fuck Arnott's put in those. Arnott's, if you're listening, please give me your secrets and email them to thiccradio@gmail.com, because I need to know what you put in these, because I am truly addicted. I've been addicted my entire life. Chicken crimpy. They fucking slap. But Tim Tams, Christ, they're good.
Yeah, I have no idea. I've never tried any of these snacks. I'm very curious about them, but I've never tried them.
So a chicken crimpy, I don't know how you would explain it in American terminology, because in Australia you'd call it a biscuit, but it's not like an American biscuit. You know how like you've got cookies, but how there are like savory cookies? What would you call that?
A savory cookie. I honestly don't know.
Like maybe it's like a cracker, but you know how like you can get crackers that are like wafer thin saltine crackers that you put like a little bit of salmon or hummus on. You have them like fucking canapé bullshit. You got those ones, and then you've got crackers that are like a bit thicker, I suppose.
Maybe
I don't know. Do you know what? We'll send you a care package. We'll do a special episode of Tim sampling Australian snacks. It'll be full ASMR, just chewing, crunching, slurping, all the good.
You're just trying so hard to get me into ASMR, aren't you?
I need you to do it for me, Tim. Just do it. Just do it. Just do it, Tim. Just do it, baby. Just do it. You know you want to. But no, look, honestly, good fresh fish with lemon, fucking fucks me up every time. It's so good. And like the go-to, like in general around Australia, like the go-to Aussie fish is like barramundi. And I feel like the fish I get here in the UK, like it's typically cod or hake, and it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. Barramundi is
I'm such a snob about it as well. Like the minute I go like too far inland, I'm like, nah, that fish won't be fresh enough.
Yeah, that's exactly the tea. Like when you go somewhere that's inland and it's like, oh, we've got a sushi restaurant. Why? What the fuck
Yeah.
are you doing, sis? This is not it. This is not the vibe. I don't. No, thank you.
Avocado roll only. Yeah.
Exactly. Curious to know for your mob, do you have a shared language that is used or at least practiced still today?
Yeah. Oh, I should know the other one, but there are two prevailing kind of languages. Jandai um is I guess the one that's used by Gurmple and Unakul.
Mhm.
And then Nuji have their own language. I forget the name of it. Um, but basically, more recent years, what's happened is they've kind of both been combined into Chandai. So because they were kind of, I guess, the three languages from three different clans, some of them were just like specific words that were maybe used by one specific clan rather than the others, or about like specific places that maybe had different, slightly different names. A lot of that's being combined into a singular language now.
Okay.
Um, so I guess yeah, Jandai is the prevailing
Jan
one.
Jandai is the one. And is there like a gaining phrase or like a word in Jandai that you love to just like mutter under your breath where you see like a cute little fat boy, you're just like, ooh.
Not not a
Not
Jedi
one.
specific one.
Not
I was gonna scroll on this, but I couldn't think of one off the top of my head, and I did a little bit of searching. I couldn't. Um, I guess like more. There's also like I guess like kind of like a Aboriginal collective language, and like there's like things like deadly or like gammon, which I think a lot of mobs use. And there's always like you watch the young kids always fight over like whose mob invented it or whatever. I think Budu, which is
yeah, Buddy
like,
means dick.
yeah.
Buddy means dick.
So
Right.
it's like when you're checking someone out, it's like, and
Mm.
it's like, yeah,
He's like, Buddy. Yeah, exactly.
but yeah,
Yeah, because I'm a fucking slut, okay? Obviously, like one of the
you would, yeah.
appropriate words I know is dick. I'm just like,
I was gonna say, yeah, James, how many different languages do you know?
yeah, I know how to say dick, a couple different ways. I don't need to know how to say hello, goodbye, or good morning. I just need to know how I'm gonna get on that dick. And so, you got to start with the basics. Budu, if they cock our eyebrow in the right direction, then we in, and we'll head back and we'll make that happen. Oh my God. You say that. There was this beautiful Torres Strait Islander guy back home. Anyways, we're not going to go into that now. He just the juiciest ass on a human. It's unfair and unreasonable. The man backed into me one time and it like knocked me off the bed. It was something. Just beautiful. I wasn't worried about voodoo then. I was worried about something completely different. Um, but that's just what that was. Um, I do want to query a little bit more with your gaming journey specifically. Like, are there plus size Indigenous Australians or people in your mob who, when you decided that you wanted to start gaining, their size, their confidence made you go, I want to be like that? Was there anyone in particular?
I don't know if it was a specific person. I think there were definitely, I don't know, yeah, that's a good question. There's definitely been community members who have kind of, noticed and kind of, I sort of admired like their confidence or the way they sort of hold themselves, navigate the world, wear the dress. But yeah, I don't know, like I don't know if couldn't pinpoint a specific, um, celebrity or like community member or yeah.
I
So
suppose like the usual ones, or like Round a Twist, where they get like the reversing remote, or the remote that like when you press it, it does the thing. And there's like the spaghetti eating contest, and they like fast forward it, and he gets really fat.
yeah, yeah. There
That's,
was yeah. I do
that's
remember that. And it's like I didn't even watch Around the Twist that much, but I think it was something that,
you
seeked
remember
out.
watching that one episode? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
As a bit of a challenge here, and I know you mentioned that like maybe the Indigenous Australian gaming community is not necessarily like fully connected or anything, but like, what would you say is like the biggest change you would want to see in that space? Can we presume that it would be to have more connection with people?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think more connections always helpful and important. I think it would be nice to just kind of connect to be able to have those kind of conversations and sort of, like sort of share advice and knowledge and experience with each other. Like just bitch a bit about things. Yeah.
I mean, the use. You want to talk to your hoes about hoe specific things, not a
Yeah.
not a big ask. Totally,
Yeah.
totally get it.
And
Um,
everyone else just needs to know who's got the best country. So
exactly. There you go. I mean, would the best country be like who gets the fattest the fastest? Like, as do
maybe.
you know what? My whiteness will come in useful. I'll be neutral territory. I'll go around different countries. We can have a feeding session, and it's like whoever makes me gain the most amount of weight, you win. There you go.
There you go. Yeah.
There you go. Not selfish intentions there at all.
I think we'll see what we can do.
We'll see what we can make happen. We'll tee something up. We'll put it in the pipeline. I do want to ask as well, like, what has been your experience being Indigenous within the gainer community in general?
Mm, yeah, I think, I don't know. I think it's something where, like I was kind of maybe suggested earlier, like something that I maybe don't share straight away, but then kind of when I have more of a connection with someone that we'll have kind of conversations about, and that's like, I guess, kind of a white passing privilege, but something then I'll sort of share, just to get a sense of what a person's politics are or where they're sort of at, with things. And I don't know, like it's generally been all right. Like, um, there was one guy who I met kind of once, and I kind of assumed, I think just through putting bits and pieces together, that like he was also Aboriginal. And so it was really nice to kind of then have that to actually talk about and kind of hear more about his community and things that he was doing.
I suppose as a final question here, just to round things out, what would you say is the number one question you want to be asked about your experience? I guess looking at that intersection of gainer, Indigenous, Quandamuka, like, what's that number one question that you want to be asked?
Oh my God, it's such a hard question. um, I don't know, I think for me, I'm still probably reconciling where my culture sort of beats gaining. And so I think I don't haven't worked that out entirely yet. And so, like trying to sort of work some of that out for me is probably important before I could probably speak to or like, have a specific question that I'd want kind of people to ask in that space.
That's fair. Maybe
Yeah.
we'll touch base on a future episode and we'll
I
take
know once I've worked it all out, yeah.
yeah. Um, though I suppose as then another last question here, maybe we have some Indigenous people listening. Maybe they're Indigenous Australian, maybe they're Indigenous US, Canada, other places. What is one piece of advice or just something I'll say this. What is one thing you want to say to that cohort listening right now?
Um, I think I think something which is always really important, and it's become more important to me over the years as well, is kind of trying to care for community. And I think as an Indigenous person, you can exist in multiple communities at once. Like so you're more if you're a gainer as well, like in the gaining community, I think there's a lot of work when you have capacity that you can do to kind of care for those communities. And that can be like sort of trying to support people like as they're on their journeys or when you have the energy and the capacity, but also yeah, kind of just looking out for one another. I think that's always really important. I think for me it's become more important as I've sort of got older and sort of had my own journey with my identities and yeah, like reconciling different things and then maybe seeing other people who are going through things that I can offer my experience or advice on. Um, and yeah, I think that's really important.
Ash, this has been such a pleasure to have you on with us today. Thank you so much for being here. Where can people find you online?
So I guess I'm partychubbybears on Instagram, is what it's called. And I don't remember what the other site's handle is, but yeah, find me there and then connect elsewhere. Yeah.
No worries. Well, that's a wrap for now here on Thicc Radio. Please remember to like and subscribe, rate us 5 stars, and leave us a good review. If you liked this episode, the podcast, or just us in general, share it with your friends and encourage them to tune in. You can find me on Instagram and BeefyFrat at stannnum.
And you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, and BeefyFrat at Thicky Mouse. You can also look us up on TikTok at Thicc Radio or at our website at www.podpage.com/Thicc Radio. If you want to submit a voice note, you can reach us at anchor.fm/Thicc Radio/message. And if you have any questions or ideas for episodes, you can reach us at thethickradio@gmail.com. So until next time, bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Let's talk about it.
Thicc Radio is a Patreon and Enter app podcast produced by Stannnum and Thicky Mouse.
Mixed and mastered by Stannnum.
Our artwork is provided by Lokitu.
Our theme song is provided by Spotify.